This is Mae Brussell at KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. I'm still not used to that Pacific Grove. I feel like it's Carmel because they're just very close to each other. But it is Pacific Grove, and this is KAZU-FM. This is broadcast number 562 at September the 13th, 1982. For those of you that subscribe to the tapes or order the printed sheets, the bibliographies that go with these radio broadcasts, I've listed a second time the source of information on the Wall Street Journal articles on the Nugan Hand Bank, the links to the highest echelons of military, CIA, and to our Pentagon officials. I'm going to present those as I outline the articles, but they're very long, and I want to condense them for you and go through them with you, even if you have the stories. August 24th, 25th, 26th, 1982, on the Nugan Hand Bank. Also, this week, there's a continuation on the story of the Vatican that I've been covering every week for you or mentioning, and this story's been going on for a long, long time. But it came to a head when Roberto Calvi of the Banco Ambrosiano, the president of that bank, was murdered in London in June. It's already several months ago. It doesn't seem possible. It seems like yesterday. But Calvi was murdered, and it opened up a long overdue story or exposure to the role of our CIA, of the United States, the Vatican, the Mormon Church, through David Kennedy or many other officials in the United States, to offshore banking, to promising security for investments that the Vatican will not stand by. Time magazine, September the 13th, 1982, has a four-part story, The Great Vatican Bank Mystery, a tale of 2 deaths, 12 investigations, and missing millions. And it is a story about plots of money that has been floating around, and investigations are underway in Italy, Britain, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Bahamas, and Peru. Now, if those investigations actually were underway, you would get a view of the international fascista movement. But I understand that just before I went on the air, through shortwave radio, through a researcher who lives in Salinas, listener to World Watchers, a long friend, she said this evening that Licio Gelli was arrested in Sweden. Now, he's the gentleman that was in charge of Mussolini's security police force, who fled to Argentina, who was brought back to Italy by the Duke of Kent, the Queen of England's cousin. He set up the international fascist group that are hoping to turn the world safe for feudalism and monarchies, and for the great opus dei that I talked about before, the most fundamental, strict sect of the Catholic Church. Calvi, allegedly, by the time you get this tape or hear it on the radio, not Calvi, but Licio Gelli should be arrested. Now, I'm sure that he had to give himself up, and he's the only person who could pull some of the missing money that went to him out of these Swiss banks and these secret accounts. And if that money is put back into those dummy fronts in Panama and in Bahamas and Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and so forth, the investigation would, of course, be called off or stopped. Now, there was another offer to stop an investigation this week. It came from down in Bolivia, from the Cocaine King, who runs the operations in Bolivia, and he offered to erase the debt to the United States. If he would turn himself in, the debt for Bolivia would be erased. Now, the Bank of America in California and worldwide, of course, has about money due from Bolivia, $10 million they loaned to Bolivia from the Bank of America. And the San Francisco Examiner last Wednesday had a story that the moderator for the drug connections for the Bank of America was a Christian vonDamm. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, I did a broadcast of a letter I wrote to Helene vonDamm, Ronald Reagan's secretary, who has a cabinet position in Washington, saying, where are your former husband and your current husband? Because She has close links to Raymond Donovan, who's under question with his mafia, Genovese Gambino, and you name it connections. She's close to Roy Cohn, a person owning property with Lynn Nofziger, close connections during Nixon's administration with Nazis in California. vonDamm has a husband who allegedly, according to an LA Times article, is a banker in Germany, and her current husband, whose name is not vonDamm, is in New Jersey, where all of these scandals are breaking. And of course, it is the head of Standard Oil New Jersey and Elmer, Bobst, the chemical companies, IG Farben, and so forth. So I wanted her to answer the letter and say where Christian vonDamm is. Coincidentally, it turns out, his name is in the news this last week, Christian vonDamm, the moderator for the cocaine connections and the debts of Bank of America. Now, she worked 8 years in California, so it's logical that he would have those California connections. But here's a gentleman offering to turn himself in to save the scandal of where some of these missing millions are. So maybe Licia Gelli has gone to Switzerland to save the bank their embarrassment. Another article in the Newsweek, September 13th, 1982. If you don't have these two or the three articles on Nugenhan, buy them. You can't buy them anymore, copy them at the library because they'll be off the stands by the time you see this. The Newsweek story, Inside the Vatican Bank, and it's got a chart of the Institute for Religious Works, the Pontifical Commission for the State of Vatican, a picture of Mr. Casaroli. He's the far-right gentleman from the Opus Dei who said, and I mentioned last week, who wants the business people and the bankers to take over and make decisions for the Vatican, that wanted to buy the debts so that these exposures wouldn't come out, in return own the voice of the Vatican, which they practically do anyway. And Mr. Casaroli is a gentleman who was quoted in the newspaper saying that we should let the Vatican be in charge of foreign affairs because the United Nations isn't working. Well, this Mr. Casaroli is involved in these banking scandals. It goes into transferring money between fascist Italy and banking institutions, that this scandal involves more than 200 banks in the world, and the looting of 1.2 billion from Italy's largest private bank. They use the word looting, counterfeit securities, and the investigation's going on. Now, when any subject gets this much attention, just as Watergate drew attention in Time and Newsweek, when they carry stories on scandals, looting, murders, counterfeit stocks, dummy fronts, organized crime syndicates, with an institution such as the Vatican, then Mr. Gelli, I guess, has to sacrifice himself and come home. I will go into detail and outline these articles, but in the meantime, I've done so much on the Vatican scandals that I'm going to give it a rest for this week and go to another part of this Italian scandal that isn't separate from the Vatican. And also, I might have mentioned before, when you're at the library checking out the Nugenhan Stories, Wall Street Journal, August the 30th, 1982, a story, Milan Mystery, how the suicide of the Ambrosiano chief exposed the tangled maze of loans to shell companies. This is a very good article about the Panama banks, and hopefully next week I'll do some more on Jim Jones in Panama, a group from World Watchers in Philadelphia with John Judge. They've put together a fantastic list of the Panamanian banks that Jim Jones was involved down in Panama, investment there, and his money, some of his money operations. The Wall Street Journal talks about the Italian press is rife with speculation. Where did the money go in Panama? Did it go to right-wing Latin American groups? Yes, it did. Did it go to the Polish Solidarity? Yes, it did. Did it go to Latin America to buy weapons like the Exocet missile to provide Argentina with weapons against Great Britain? Yes, it did. The international fascist group out of Italy that was formed is anti-British, it's anti-American, and this money is going to South and Central America to set up an organization or continuous series of organizations that eventually will take over the world and, as I say, make it safe for the Inquisition and for the monarchies. So I'll go into those later, but there are some other things this week that I did want to cover. Briefly, I just want to mention the death of the conductor in Oakland, this Calvin Simmons. Many of you back east hardly got a news story about it, but it makes an important story because, as described in the San Francisco Examiner and the LA Times, he was the first black to lead a major U.S. symphony orchestra. He was considered a genius and a true musical genius, working with all the who's who of the music world. He was about to go into Wagner. He was conducting Mozart and Brahms, typically the German musicians that he was interpreting and conducting. And 3 weeks from the time that he died, and he was supposed to have been in the best spirits ever, he was to play with the New York Opera and conduct there. Now, there are several articles about his death that concern me. One was August the 24th. New York search continues for body of Oakland's missing conductor. He allegedly stood up in a canoe. He fell over, and the article says the precise cause of death is not known. He immediately disappeared and never came up again. He was in good health. He was in good spirits. He knew how to canoe. He'd been up there before to the lake many times. He had been swimming and fishing, according to his mother, since he was young. He never bobbed up once, and he wasn't tangled in weeds. He was anywhere from 50 to 150 feet from the shore, and he was about as the most talented young opera conductor in the world to come to New York City. Now, an interesting story in the San Francisco Examiner, August the 24th, tells what preceded the canoe ride. It says that there was a party of 7 that gathered at the home of a pediatrician up on this lake. It was right near Lake Placid where the Olympic Games were. And as I say, he was supposed to go to New York. He was studying the Magic Flute by Mozart, and he was to conduct it 3 weeks later at the New York City Opera. A party of 7 gathered in the home of a pediatrician, Dr. Ginger Weeks, located 40 yards from the pond's edge. Rosinski, this was his friend that he was staying with, the son of the famous conductor, and the mother, the widow of the famous conductor Arthur Rosinski, who had a summer cabin up on this lake. The dinner party consisted of Mr. Simmons and Mr. Rosinski, his friend, also a musician, and his mother, and, in quotes, a London-based member of the U.S. Foreign Services and his wife, and another woman who was an ex-ambassador somewhere. Now, this is not wire service. It's special to the San Francisco Examiner from Lake Placid. 2 people from the Foreign Service and one who's an ex-ambassador from somewhere. It just not mentioned at all. It reminds me of the luncheon that Adelaide Stevenson had before he walked down the streets in London and fell dead and obviously was poisoned, and he was at the company of people from the CIA at this particular luncheon. Now, Simmons goes to a dinner party. He's dressed for dinner. It may not be formal at a summer cabin. He has on his shoes and jacket. And he's out on a boat, and as if he was posing for a picture. There were 2 people on the property of where the ambassador and the Foreign Service were, this Dr. Ginger Weeks. And allegedly, one of the women thought he was so photogenic, she wanted to take a picture of him. He was supposed to be posing for a picture against the background of a dazzling sunset. This is the story of the driver for the Lake Placid Fire Department. He stood up, which you don't do in a canoe. He was silhouetted, and they wanted to take his picture. This is in the newspaper account of the story. Doesn't say, okay, they want to take a picture. They have the lens taken. He stands up. Where's the picture? And then all of a sudden he falls over, and they said the next thing they saw was the canoe going around in circles. He didn't appear. 10 days later, the body was found. He allegedly stood up to pose for a picture. David Emery up in the Bay Area called me and said he was very suspicious. Was there a frogman or somebody who pulled him in, that he went under and didn't hold on to the boat, never came up again, 3 weeks from his great introduction to the music and Mozart of New York City conducting there. According to one San Francisco Examiner story, September the 1st, no one saw Mr. Simmons enter the water. All we have is conjecture. People heard a splash. No one came up from the overturned canoe. The state police said they believed it was an accidental drowning. He just fell out, never came to the surface. The pond is surrounded by private homes, and according to another story, August the 23rd, he must have had a heart attack or something. And goodness knows what the something was, but he was the first black conductor of a major symphony orchestra in the United States who went out on a boat. He had made musical history. He had worked with all the accomplished musicians in this country. He loved Mozart, Brahms, Beethoven, and his new territory was Wagner. Lots of luck, Simmons. You know, you just can't make that circle of the Music Society and be black. It will never happen, and it didn't happen. And whatever happened to him, we don't know, but the circumstances were so convoluted. Now, Chief of Police Gates in Los Angeles came out with a suggestion. He's being sued and under criticism for the chokehold, where 14 black people have been choked by the Los Angeles Police Department that they tried to blame on their blood and cells doesn't circulate. You know, it's different. Not that they're held tighter by the throat, but that their blood doesn't circulate right. So they suggested, there's an article in the paper this last week, that Rockwell International suggested, in place of this chokehold, that they use a bolo-type weapon, a glue-like substance, and a device that temporarily interrupts the brain. So if Rockwell has this substance, and if there's a laser gun or some kind of a gun or something that could shoot out at Calvi when he's in the canoe, or if he was told to go out and pose for a picture that these women wanted a picture, why else would he leave a dinner when he goes there and meets an ambassador and people from the foreign service? I doubt that he'd say, "Excuse me, I want to go out on a canoe." He might have been told, I don't know what the circumstances were that got him to the boat, but he may have been told, "We've got some music fans of yours that just want to take your picture." And once he was on that boat, for some reason, he went in and didn't come back. Now, there was an article from the Houston Chronicle that may or may not have anything to do with Calvin Simmons, but it has something to do with somebody, and it's an important story which didn't make the wire service, but sent to me from a friend in Houston, Texas, who sends me many, many articles. It said some police suspected he was a foreign agent, French citizen suicide, here a mystery. And the thing that caught my eye about this so-called agent, Patrick Frederick Gerville, 27, suspected of being a foreign agent, was that he was a scuba diver. He was suggested by police he was a professional scuba diver and a dog trainer. He'd been in the United States since April from France, and he stayed at the Best Western Hotel. One of them he was working, he said, for a Houston-based oil company. He was well-dressed. He seemed to be well-off, meticulously dressed, man-of-the-world Frenchman, working for a Houston oil company. Now, when he got into town, he asked for a security guard, according to the Houston Chronicle. This is September the 1st, 1982. The accident was in August 23rd, when Calvin Simmons went into the water. It said that he came into town and he solicited early for a bodyguard to protect him because there may be an unknown foe. And he came to Houston to collect some money. He was going to get some cash, according to this article, and he came to Houston on a business deal. Now, he had hired a bodyguard that night, and then for the excuse that he was drunk in the lounge and bothering people, the Houston police took him into the police department. If he had a bodyguard that night, I don't know why they would take him to the police department, but at that point, he took some cyanide, dropped his head between his legs, his ears turned purple, he started bleeding from the mouth. They went to the hotel room where he also had the accoutrements like Gary Powers was supposed to take if the U-2 flight was caught over the Soviet Union and was known as a weather plane, which he didn't take. That's history already for many of you. This fellow took the cyanide pill. But then when they went to the room, they said it was unusual for anybody to be walking around with cyanide, much less to keep it in the room. So that his background is not known. He had various passports. He had his papers. He said he worked in Houston. He had a Nevada driver's license, and he was an excellent scuba diver, and he had the necessary poisons, and goodness knows maybe he had some other kind of poison. And what cities was he in before he went to Houston, and who was he being paid by, and why did he think he would be killed, and what was the other poison for, and why did he take this? After the Houston police picked him up, he took the cyanide. Now, you can't make two connections except that he was a scuba diver being paid for something. He obviously didn't want his traces. If he thought somebody was going to kill him, he wouldn't kill himself. If somebody's going to off you the night you're going to be paid, working for a Houston Oil Company with a license from RENA, that's like Senator Nolan of California committing suicide because he thinks somebody's going to kill him. The whole thing is preposterous, but that is the story, and Calvin Simmons' mystery is muddy waters, and the story coming out of Lake Placid, the people at the dinner were not even mentioned. Very carefully avoided an ambassador from somewhere. Now, there was another accident that may or may not be interesting that has some little subtle overtones, and I'll just give you about 5 minutes of it, and that was the car accident of Janet Gaynor and Mary Martin, and Janet Gaynor's husband, and Mrs. Martin's friend and companion and producer who was killed in the car accident. The next day there was a photograph of Janet Gaynor and Mary Martin at a department store promotion for a cosmetic product sold in Los Angeles. They have had their picture for I. Magnin selling Velvaderm. It cost $42 an ounce, and it was a cosmetic created by Dr. Sam Glass in Los Angeles, an endocrinologist. I happen to know the whole case because I've known Sam Glass all of my life, since I can ever remember. He's been a friend of the family's. Now, these women were promoting a particular face cream, but when the accident took place, the man that hit them had an interesting career. He was a security guard. There were allegations he worked for the San Francisco Police Department. In the ambulance going to, when he was picked up with the cab driver to see if they needed care or taking him to the jail, and he was released immediately with $350 put down, he was not incoherent. According to the cab driver, who never had an accident before in his life, he was raving all the way to the hospital about the Jews, how he hated Jews, and there was this tremendous anti-Semitic overtone. He had a friend whose car he was using from Denver, Colorado. He was from Denver, Colorado. He lived in the Bay Area. He managed a lot of department stores, apartment houses in San Francisco. He knew his way around. He worked as a security guard and with the police. He had chased another woman. He was arrested for allegedly a hit-run or assault with the car to attack somebody, and she jumped on the hood of the car. And as usually happens, he got off with serving a certain amount of time in public service and was not reprimanded in any particular way. So he was out loose managing apartment houses, and he went into these particular women who have been in business selling this face cream. Dr. Glasses at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. It just happens to be a Jewish doctor. I. Magnin was a Jewish firm. It was taken over later as a large corporate, but it was started by Jews. The women have worked closely with Jewish people, and whether he knew something and was aiming for them, I don't know. But he was not, apparently, according to this person, really drunk. He was in a different world, and all he thought about was himself. He didn't ask who he hit or what happened. So his reaction was very funny and consistent with somebody who really wanted to do a job. And then in the Los Angeles Times and in the Chronicle today, September 13th, there's an article, "Man accused of hitting actresses loses his license." Now that's a funny thing. He hit the actresses, so he lost his license. He killed a man, and now they're making it look like he lost his license because he hit the women. A person in the car was dead, and Janet Gaynor is still in critical trouble. There were many multiple injuries of these people, but all of a sudden he's lost it because he hit the women. another person who sells cosmetics, a different kind of person, one day earlier had an accident also. And she links, and this is a little broader subject, she links back to Clay Shaw, the Permadex operation, to Licio Gelli, to the P2 Masonic Lodge, and the International Fascista Network. That's Princess Marcella Borghese. Now, she was in New York City visiting one of her children, and she's the founder of a cosmetic company, which, according to UPI, she was touring around to sell her new face cream. She was embarking on a nationwide tour to promote her new cream. So you have these women opposed, competing in the same kind of merchandise with their $40, $42 an ounce makeup. She belongs to this very vicious, fascist, far right-wing network of Hitler and Mussolini's leg men before and after the war. She, according to the article, she caters to wealthy, high-fashion clients. Also, she fell in a bathtub in New York City and severely burned herself by scalding water just at the time that Mr. Gelli is coming home. She's in a hospital, New York Hospital, Cornell Medical Center. She couldn't turn the water off, and the hot water was on her for 30 minutes, and she was scalded unconscious in a tub with hot running water. This is Princess Marcella Borghese. Now, her name comes up in the Torbett document, in the book that Paris Lemon did on the Kennedy conspiracy. She also was in the address book of Clay Shaw, the gentleman who worked with the International Fascista group and made the connections in New Orleans to the people who killed John Kennedy and also the crime syndicate, the Carlos Marcello gang. In his notebook, Clay Shaw has Principessa Marcella Borghese, Via Tirola Street in Rome, Italy, phone number 687-448. Clay Shaw was very familiar with this Princess Marcella Borghese, and also she's mentioned in in the book The Kennedy Conspiracy by Paris Lemon. This princess is mentioned. When I was looking up the references to Clay Shaw's notebook with Marcella Borghese in there, I came across the name Theo Savory Brilliant, and they shared an apartment, Clay Shaw and the Brilliants, in Mexico, and they have her number and address and also Memphis, Tennessee under it. As soon as I came from New Orleans in 1967 and went to meet Jim Garrison and to help him make connections of the Clay Shaw role in New Orleans to the Dallas connections in the murder of John Kennedy, I wasn't home 3 days before the Theo Savory Brilliants wanted to meet me at the Thunderbird bookstore, which was out in the valley in those days, Carmel Valley. It's moved out to the mouth of the valley now, but we used to call that the Casbah, where all the spies were, and I was surrounded by Clay Shaw's buddies wanting to know what I was doing in New Orleans and so forth. In the Paris Lemon book, Kennedy Conspiracy, page 224, and again, David Emery up north was the one that quickly found these references, the name and address of Principessa Marcella Borghese. And she's related to Prince Valerio Borghese, referred to as the Black Prince or the new Duce of the Movimento Sociale Italiano. She's a relative of those people who would put in the next Il Duce, who worked with Licio Gelli and Paul Marcinkus, Roberto Calvi, Pope Paul VI, Pope John Paul II. They're still operating. It's been since 1967 that these names surfaced in Italy and in New Orleans, and in 1968, 69 in Paris Lemon's book. But they're still traveling around and operating, and this new Duce, the one that's related to her, is described as anti-British and anti-American. And they've been trying to break the banks of America, break the banks of Great Britain, get tremendous loans, not pay them back, and force us into economic crisis, because Adolf Hitler had a very carefully planned. He stated, if you want to take America, take South America first, so that the network from Rome to South America, Central America, and Europe and Madrid became very tight. And as I say, this particular lady is still surfacing. Another name was in the news this week who surfaced. He's operating, and he's named in the Torbett document, working with the International Fascist Group, and that's Clifford Jones. I'll turn this tape over now, and we'll take a 1-minute break. Then we'll go back and I'll refer to Clifford Jones, who's mentioned in the Torbett document, and his role in the Kennedy assassination, now located in Greece, wanting to open up a casino in Greece. Andreas Papandreou's government was smart enough to turn it down, but these people are still very much in business. On the past, a lot on the past, but it's soon the anniversary of Kennedy's death, and you can remember some of that network, I hope. I'll be back with you next week. This is KAZU in Pacific Grove. Tape number 562, September 13th, 1982. When I saw the Princess Borghese's name and the anti-Semitism that went into the car crash is simply organized, he knew what he was doing, attack against Mary Martin and Janet Gaynor in the Bay Area, and the surfacing of these weird circumstances, the racist death of Calvin Simmons and the operation still going, I thought it was timely to get back to the Torbett document and the Kennedy conspiracy, because many new listeners do not have this information. Those who subscribe to the tape, there's new subscribers all the time. Some of you have it. And many of the old listeners have the material, but I think it was broadcast 270 when I went into some of this in great length, and we're back at 562, so you see how long ago that was. The Wall Street Journal, not making any connections to these operations, of course, said, Greece blocks the sale of a casino to an American, September the 7th, 1982. The Greek National Tourist Organization blocked the sale of a casino near Athens to Clifford Jones, an American investor. And he's written up by David Copeland and the men who put together the Torbett document on Permindex operation, Clifford Jones and his connections to the crime syndicate and Lyndon Johnson and the assassination teams. The article says the Greek newspaper reported that Mr. Jones had bought all the shares of the Attica Hotel, Teleferic, and Casino Company last month for a total of $6 million. You see, here's Andreas Papandreou wanting to make changes in Greece and finally getting elected after they got the military junta out. And here's a member of Permindex and the International Assassination Squad coming up with $16 million to buy all the shares of a hotel in Greece. The agency's Secretary General said the share transfer is illegal and invalid. It's a direct violation of the casino agreements in Greece, and they turned him down. Mr. Jones, according to the Wall Street Journal, has small interest in 70 casinos throughout the world. He had interest in Cuba before the Castro government took over the country. You bet he did, with Mr. Batista and E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis and the whole Carlos Prios Sequeiros and the whole team around Lyndon Johnson. He was close to them. He was part of Permindex. He's described in the books. So while the Princess Borghese is in New York, Mr. Clifford Jones is in Greece, still operating $6 million for a particular hotel and casino and 70 other casinos around the world. Now, the casinos help fund the fascist organizations because they, through drug running, which is the largest industry in the United States, you can buy arms, weapons, newspapers, business fronts, and so forth. You put them in offshore banking, you hide where they are, and you keep the operation feeding and going until you arm the whole world and have set up these various business fronts. I'd love to know the 70 casinos that Clifford Jones has a piece in, and then you'd know another 70 city network of Martin Bormann and William Buckley and the CIA dummy fronts, because, as I say, they are part of the fascist organization. There is no organized crime as such in the Soviet Union or China. The purpose of these communist countries is to get people into production and be productive, and the crime syndicate does not work in communist countries, and that's one reason the crime syndicate is so violently anti-communist, because they need a place to sell their drugs. If you bought the Forbes article this month of the 400 richest, it includes Meyer Lansky and Robert Vesco. I might have mentioned it before, and I think I could mention it every week. But I bet out of the 400, there's at least 25% or 50% of those people who use the crime syndicate network also in order to make the 400 Club. Just as I mentioned, Daniel Ludwig, who was #1 in the Forbes, and then in the Wall Street Journal is named as having an airstrip with the narcotics from Southeast Asia, flies from his airstrip owned by him and Pat Boone. So in order to be the richest man of America, you simply can't make it with oil tankers or forests. You have to be also on the dope dealing angle of bringing in the drugs. So maybe all 400 have a piece, but drugs are important, and these 70 casinos of Mr. Jones, I'm sure, are important. Incidentally, before I get too far into the casinos or the Kennedy conspiracy, to give a resume again on the people in Italy and in the United States who not only were involved in killing Kennedy almost 20 years ago, but who are hiding their asses, who are in the news today. I do want to mention that among other names in Clay Shaw's notebook was a man named Raymond Paris from Manchester, New Hampshire. I called there yesterday on the fluke that Mr. Paris was there, or even still alive, because this notebook was in 1967, 163 Seneca Lane. There was no Roland Paris there, but at this time, Clay Shaw worked for the CIA. He had worked with the OSS and was on the board of directors of these two corporations in Italy at the time that Jim Garrison arrested him. The reason I was interested in the Manchester, New Hampshire location was because in the Washington Post article of March the 2nd, 1975, it says that when Fritz Kramer came to the United States to recruit Henry Kissinger and later represent the monarchies in the Pentagon and the fascist organizations that are also cover all of these institutions in Rome and in Germany, the highest level of Mussolini and Hitler's entourage. When Fritz Kramer came to this country, he first went to New Hampshire. He headed to New England, to New Hampshire, and he stayed there and then went down to Washington, D.C. Mr. Kramer went to Washington to do research at the Library of Congress, then was put in Army intelligence in 1943 and recruited Henry Kissinger, and then took him back to Germany, and I talked about what happened after that many times. But in the notebook of Clay Shaw, with the international network of European and worldwide Nazi fronts and organizations, is a particular reference to a man in New Hampshire, and also in the Fritz Kramer article, the first place that Kramer went was New Hampshire. Now, rereading the Kennedy conspiracy, and you can go over it all the time for new information. I also learned, David Emery called me, look up the name William Grace, because J. Peter Grace has been given an appointment by Ronald Reagan to cut our domestic spending, and he's the business partner of Otto Ambrose from I.G. Farben with genocide, slave labor, mass assassinations. When George DeMohrenschildt came from Europe to South America, to the United States, he was the close associate of William Grace. The father of J. Peter Grace and George DeMohrenschildt, of course, was also a Nazi. So what you get is a Nazi from the era of the Kennedy assassination, involved with Lee and Marina Oswald, getting them jobs, housing, locations, framing him for having had a rifle that killed the president that nobody ever saw in Lee Harvey Oswald at any single time. George DeMohrenschildt was working with Mr. Grace. They're members of the Vatican, Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and he was familiar with well-trained South American spies in Mexico, Central Europe, South America, and DeMohrenschildt made the route of Central, South America, Mexico, and so forth. And in the book, The Kennedy Conspiracy, Flamone refers to the Roman Catholic Church became a spy system, and they refer again to a book, Danger on the Right, published in 1964, the year after Kennedy was killed. And many of the people in that book, incidentally, are and were involved in the Kennedy assassination. But this book says the Roman Catholic Church would be perfect for a spy system through the priest, because the priest's first loyalty was always to the Vatican. The Vatican wanted a job done. Now, the story of the network from Rome to Johannesburg and Israel and Montreal and New Orleans and Dallas, the assassination teams, broke when Jim Garrison arrested Clay Shaw in New Orleans. And then the Italian newspaper Pace Sera is quoted in this particular book, The Kennedy Conspiracy, March the 4th, 1967, and different dates. The Italian newspapers began stories on Clay Shaw after Jim Garrison arrested him. So while Jim Garrison didn't get much headway with the arrest of Clay Shaw, the day after he arrested him in New Orleans for the role in killing John Kennedy, or for some part of it, David Ferry, a primary witness, was murdered with a karate chop. So, and many other things happened at Jim Garrison's trial. That's another story. But the newspaper in Italy, Pace Sera, in 1967, explained that there were organizations set up in Rome that at that time, in 1967, were very mysterious. But 1970, they were clarified by Bill Boxley and David Copeland. But in 1967, this is what they had to say about Clay Shaw. They said that in 1959, the Società Italo-Americana was formed in Italy. Mr. George Mandel, his name is Giorgio Mantello, from Hungary, set it up, and the purpose, allegedly the purpose then, was for industry and commerce, although they weren't involved with industry or commerce, and later it turned out they were set up to have assassination teams go all over the world to kill the people that they believed stood in their way for oil companies or for fascism in some way or the other. Now, Richard Nixon was selected. He was vice president under Eisenhower. He was selected to be the president in 1960. John Kennedy won the election, but by 1959, the assassination teams and the potential, in case anybody won against Richard Nixon, and already Ronald Reagan was being groomed, and heads of states all over the world were following and have fallen continuously. By 1959, this group was set up in Rome, and with the cover of Industry and Commerce. November 14th, 1959, they created what they called the Italo-American Hotel Corporation. Well, you see Clifford Jones, 20 years later, this was in 1967, they were talking about it. He's got $6 million to buy a hotel in Athens. He has a piece in 70 casinos. They were to set up what they called a hotel corporation in 1959. In 1960 is when Robert Mae was working with the FBI, the CIA, setting assassination teams with John Rosselli, Sam Giancana, Sandro Trafficani, with Sheffield Edwards and William Harvey of the CIA, under the guise of the user organization, because it was a privately owned corporation like Daniel Ludwig or the Bechtel Corporation. They were private corporations so that they could set up the hit teams that were involved in these murders. If they were supposed to get Castro, that's the only one they missed, but they seem to have gotten everyone else. So in 1967, the organization formed 6 years earlier was exposed in the Rome newspapers. It was established in Rome, called the Centro Mondiale Commerciale, the CMC. In 1959 was the Società Italia Americana. And then the Centro Mondiale Commerciale was set up in 1961 when John Kennedy had already become president. And on the board of directors of both the institutions, formed in 1959 and in 1961, was Clay Shaw from the OSS, who worked with Allen Dulles, Wild Bill Donovan, Reinhard Galen, William Casey, Maxwell Taylor. He was from the OSS, became the CIA, and Mr. Bloomfield, an attorney from Montreal. Now, they were on the board of directors of both organizations. Clay Shaw from the OSS worked with Dulles, worked with Wild Bill Donovan, worked with the Italian fascists, putting in the military right in Europe, setting up the hit teams, and George Mandel created the other society in 1959, but the common denominator between these two was Mr. Bloomfield and Clay Shaw. Now, the banks they used to set it up, and later they could spread it then out to banks all over the world, Banco Nazionale del Lavoro, it looks like Nazi, N-A-Z-I-O-N-A-L-E in Italy, the Banco Astal Badus in Switzerland, the Miami Astal Badus in America, and the Seligman Bank of Basel. And then Seligman and the other Swiss bank branched out to the Credit Suisse, also for counterintelligence and funding fascist organizations. So these two groups were founded, and the banks, the main banks in Basel, Switzerland, got the bulk of the money started and used the CIA and the former OSS people to set up these assassination teams. Now, the board of Centro Mondiale Commerciale was written up in Italy in 1967. Also in Who's Who of the Southwest, Clay Shaw is mentioned there. They included the top Italian officials, a Swiss professor, Max Hegemann, the owner and editor of National Zeitung, Swiss minister Ernest Feiss, Professor Edgar Saline from the University of Basel, Dr. Enrico Mantello, the brother of George Mandel, who was the power behind forming the organization in 1959. Frank Nagy, who also from Hungary worked with his international fascist group. He was the leader of an anti-communist countrymen's party, president of Permindex, which was the Rome office of CMC. They had branches all over the world, but Permindex was the Rome office, and this Frank Nagy was the common denominator there, besides being in Dallas, Texas, when John Kennedy was murdered, being on the board with Clay Shaw in New Orleans, and a close associate of J. Edgar Hoover. He bought a huge estate, I believe, in Virginia. Frank Nagy, his family all moved over here from Hungary. He was a multi-millionaire who left Europe after the war and worked in all the various countries, Africa, South America, and just happened coincidentally, as I say, to be in Dallas when Kennedy was killed. And the connections, of course, were very plain after we did 5 or 10 years to the New Orleans to Clay Shaw. I mean, it didn't take Jim Garrison, well, till 1967 to make his connections there of Clay Shaw to David Ferry, to the OSS, to Reinhard Gehlen. And I believe when I was in New Orleans, Jim Garrison said that Clay Shaw was one of the first people to interview Reinhard Gehlen before he was dressed as a general and brought to the United States to form the CIA. Now, the board of Permindex was in Rome. It was set up by Prince Gutierrez di Spadafora, the head of the mafia syndicate from Sicily, and his son married the daughter of Marcella, Adolf Hitler's Minister of Finance. You've heard me mention his name before. So on the board of Permindex, on the board of the organization set up by the CIA and the OSS, is a man whose son married the daughter of Marcella. And then Otto Skorzeny had a child who married the daughter, forget whether it was the daughter or the son of Marcella. I should know it now. So Otto Skorzeny, called the most dangerous man in Europe, a genius of counterintelligence for Adolf Hitler and Mussolini, who was released and walked out of jail, set up his international headquarters in Madrid for Martin Bormann and Licio Gelli and the Masonic P2 gang that were going to overthrow Italy and put in the new Il Duce, the Borghese cousin. These people were related to each other. You can imagine a family party of Marcella, who was released by John J. McCloy of the Warren Commission, Marcella, Otto Skorzeny, Prince di Spadafora. You could see a Christmas celebration where all of them and their children are together, and they are all on the board of directors, or they're the gunmen or the money men for the international group that was formed as early as 1943 to get ready for World War III. Now, the background of these people on the board, I'm just naming a few of them because you won't remember all the names anyway, but Mr. Giorgio Mantello, according to Paris Flamand, was condemned for criminal activities. They contributed to Jacques Cousteau, the Frenchman, who was behind the assassination attempt of de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle. The first stories that came out exposing the international links were set up by Charles de Gaulle when there was an attempt to murder him. And then a book came out called Farewell America. And then that book led to the Torbet document, and the Paris-Limon book had these international connections too. The reason I'm bringing them up now and not on the anniversary of Kennedy's death is that the names are in the news today, and these people are still functioning and moving, and they're well funded. Another member of Permindex in the Centro Mondiale was Giuseppe Zicotta, Z-I-G-I-O-T-T-I, Zitoi, I can't pronounce the Italian name, Z-I-G-I-O-T-T-I, a member of this group, the Permindex group, president of the Fascist National Association for Militia and Arms and Weapons. Mr. H. Simon Fay, Hungarian refugee, director of the BODA Agency for Provocative Information on Socialists. The who's who included Major L.M. Bloomfield, formerly OSS with Clay Shaw, affiliated with the CIA, both of them who held 50% of the stock of this Permindex operation of these two corporations. There were 5,000 shares. He held 250,000 shares and was actively involved with controlled Le Credit Suisse of Canada, the Kanscott Realty Corporation, the Israeli Continental Company. And again, here is Israel working with Permindex, working with the international fascists, with the international mafia team. One of the high financial backers of these organizations was Dr. David Begun, B-I-E-G-U-N, National Secretary of the National Committee for Labor in Israel with offices in New York City. When the two companies were kicked out of Italy in 1962 for suspicious activity, they went to Johannesburg, and allegedly a Jew, Dr. David Begun, was the one to arrange the financial moving from Rome and Switzerland to Johannesburg, South Africa. This was in Pesa Sera newspaper, March 18th, 1967. This is not just the Vatican that's involved in these conspiracies, but I believe, again, that many of the leaders in Israel are not actually Jewish, but were handpicked by the international fascist group. Now, in 1967, before the Torbet document came out, the Italian newspaper, March 18th, was asking these questions after Clay Shaw was arrested. And the questions were quoted in Paris-Limon's book. There was unlimited sums of money going to these two companies. The CMC was the shortcut name for the Permindex operation. Who was getting it? 5 years of activity. This is from 1961 to 1967. It seemed to begin nowhere and go nowhere. It accomplished little or accomplished nothing. It received money from unnamed sources. Now that's interesting because John Kennedy was already murdered, and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King were going to be killed the next year. But they hadn't traced it in 1967. They said it accomplished little while countries were being overthrown in Central America, South America, Egypt. Otto Skorzeny and the Nazi Bormann Brotherhood were training Nasser and Sadat and Gaddafi as a colonel, a young person. The money was being used, but they hadn't yet made the connections. And the article said it's delivered to anonymous persons for causes, vast sums, and the institution in Rome and in Johannesburg would change presidents and directors. They changed 10 times every 6 months, but the men who controlled its destinies are always the same. Then the Italian newspaper said that the Centro Mondiale Commerciale is the creature of the CIA, set up as a cover for the transfer of CIA money. The funds would go to Italy for illegal political espionage. It was a point of contact, this is a quotation, for persons with a common denominator who are anti-communist. It will swallow up all those in the world who have fought for decent relations between the East and West, including John Kennedy. So evidently, I take that back, in 1967, they figured out that John Kennedy had been swallowed up, or they based it on the fact that Clay Shaw had arrested, Jim Garrison had arrested Clay Shaw for a part in the killing of the murder, and Clay Shaw was on the board of directors, one of the founders of Centro Mondial Comercial, and that it was a cover for the CIA. Now, if the CIA wasn't putting money in there, they certainly controlled the Warren Commission. They controlled Earl Warren. They controlled the questions. The agents, in fact, Allen Dulles, who set up Clay Shaw and Mr. Bloomfield and the OSS, and the CIA was on the Warren Commission to make sure that he handled all the conspiracy aspects of the Kennedy murder, as was John J. McCloy, who released the Nazis, who got the Bormann Brotherhood going again, and Otto Skorzeny and Hjalmar Schacht and all those relatives were released by the very people that were on the Warren Commission. So the money was going from the United States to Italy and was mentioned in this article, and they referred to the mysterious financial manipulations, the people from the fascist organizations, the far right, the father-in-law of Hitler's finance minister, the former member of Mussolini's cabinet. So when Jim Garrison arrested Clay Shaw, he did a monumental thing in smoking out in the press of Europe these connections. And when the 1967 articles came out, Paris Flamon's book was then published, and it was the information he got from Jim Garrison in New Orleans. He gave credit to Jim Garrison when he wrote the book, The Kennedy Conspiracy, bringing in all these people. And then a few years later, David Copeland, who used the title The Torbett Document, and Bill Boxley, formerly of the CIA, and another person, I believe, these were the combinations, got out under a nom de plume the story of the cabal and the assassination. Known, and maybe you have it, and if you don't have it, you can order copies of it. The Torbett Document, copied, is $15. It's an unpublished manuscript if you want to own it, and you should. And among the people mentioned as playing a role, particularly from the Texas Southwest area, was Lyndon Johnson, and Mr. Bloomfield from up in Canada, Frank Nage, who was in Dallas when Kennedy was killed, Carlos Prios-Sequeiros, who had the gambling syndicate over in Cuba, with Mr. Clifford Jones, Bobby Baker. There was H.L. Hunt, Mr. Louis McWillie, Roy Cohn. I mean, these people are still active. Roy Cohn is close to Helene vonDamm. I have pictures of them together. If Christian vonDamm, her husband, is making deals with the cocaine chief and the Bank of America, they never have stopped their connections to the drugs. The names are in the news today, so the Torbett Document and the Kennedy Conspiracy are timely and always will be timely, because some of these are dead and their names come up and some are alive and they're still functioning under the same capacity. Another man mentioned was Fred Korth. He was kicked out of the Navy. He was Secretary of the Navy. John Kennedy kicked him out a few weeks before Kennedy was murdered because of the scandals of the airplane contracts, the F-111 that kept crashing during the Vietnam War. I have one book on just the F-111s going down. Fred Korth was handling for the banks in the Fort Worth, Dallas-Fort Worth area, the contracts with the F-111, and his attorney was a man who represented Mr. Ekdahl, Marina Oswald's attorney. When she wanted a divorce from Mr. Ekdahl, Fred Korth had the same attorney. They all worked close together, and then linking to the Texas entourage was Guy Bannister and Robert Mayu from Chicago FBI, and then Guy Bannister goes down to New Orleans to open an office that's back-to-back to Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans. The Permindex and the Centro Mondial Comercial were set up, and the articles in Time and Newsweek of the Vatican this week refer to the funds in 1942 that were unleashed. See, Mussolini gave the Vatican $89 million in 1929 that sat there, and when World War II was over, that money went into funding and to these banks to set up later these kinds of organizations that would be the hit team to keep the world safe, as I say, for royalty and the Inquisition, to wipe out the Antichrist if it's Russia, and set up a machinery whereby anybody who stood in their way would be killed. As I say, you can get the Torbit document. It is available if you write to me, and I have some statistics and figures and quotations on the printed sheet that comes with this broadcast. If you send for sheets and you hear this program on the radio, you can write to me at Box 22511, Carmel 93922, and send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll send you a bibliography of these programs. But because Princess Borghese again is mentioned, and this Clifford Jones over in Athens, they're still operating casinos. They still have a lot of money. They're still pushing their products. They're linked to the fascist organizations. And with Jelly coming home now, maybe the lid will be put on some of the investigations. If he was arrested, as I heard he was this evening, maybe that'll close the story. He'll pull money out of his Swiss banks that is funded into there and pay off the debts of the Vatican so that there's no more investigation. It'll be interesting to see what follows. But in the meantime, my time is up. It's the end of 1 hour. And hopefully within the next week or two, I will outline those other articles and share them with you because they're so important. And there may be certain keywords or names that you are missing. So if you have them side by side, the Wall Street Journal and Time and Newsweek, and I outline certain keys or clues of what happened in the past and what to look for in the future, you hold on the articles, they'll be more valuable than my just throwing a lot of names on the air. So time is up. It's the end of 1 hour. This is Mae Brussell at KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove. I'll be back with you next week.